Kid in 17A, sit still. The harsh voice drowned out the intercom. Outside the window, encrypted F-22 communications crackled. We've lost data link. Need authentication now. The girl in the gray hoodie pulled out a faded silver badge marked Falcon. Mocking laughter filled the air. Kid's toy. Suddenly, NORAD broke radio silence. Falcon? Stand by. 2 F-22 pilots froze in their cockpits. That name couldn't possibly be coming from a civilian passenger seat. The night flight from Istanbul to New York hummed quietly through dark skies. Golden cabin lights created a warm atmosphere as passengers settled in for the long international journey ahead. Elena Falk, 16 years old, sat small and unnoticed in window seat 17A. Her long brown hair framed a pale face with deep brown eyes that seemed older than her years. She wore a simple gray hoodie, black jeans, and worn canvas sneakers that marked her as just another teenager traveling alone. She clutched a faded canvas bag in her lap, with old headphones hanging around her neck like a teenage accessory. To other passengers, she looked like any young person traveling between continents, probably a student or someone visiting family. The group of young men in row 16 whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing back at her with amused expressions. "Kid playing pilot?" one of them said loudly enough for others to hear. The entire group burst into laughter. The businessman in seat 17C frowned at her presence with obvious irritation. "Sit still, kid," he said dismissively. "Stop fidgeting around." Elena took exactly 3 measured sips of water, then placed the cup down with unusual precision. The motion was automatic, disciplined in a way that seemed strange for a teenager. She absently rubbed a small callus on her thumb, a mark that would be familiar to anyone who had spent years operating precision joystick controls. But none of the passengers noticed these subtle details. When Elena reached for a pen from her bag, a flash of silver caught the cabin light. It was a worn metal badge with the engraved image of a falcon, so faded that the details were barely visible. An elderly man in seat 18D caught a glimpse of the badge and jerked slightly in recognition. His experienced eyes suddenly focused on Elena with sharp attention and growing amazement. Elena began writing small symbols on her boarding pass, cryptic notations that meant nothing to casual observers. Her handwriting was precise and systematic, like someone trained in technical documentation. Other passengers continued their conversations and entertainment, occasionally making jokes about the young girl who seemed out of place among the international business travelers. "Probably plays too many airplane video games," someone said loudly enough for Elena to hear. "Kids these days think they know everything about flying." Elena remained silent through all the commentary, focusing on her small notebook and the symbols she was carefully recording. Her composure was remarkable for someone her age, showing none of the defensiveness that might be expected from a teenager being mocked by adults. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, checking on passengers and ensuring everyone was comfortable for the long flight ahead. They noticed Elena's young age, but assumed she was just another unaccompanied minor traveling between family members. The businessman beside her dozed off, secure in his assumption that he was sitting next to an ordinary teenager who would cause no problems during the flight. The young men ahead continued their quiet jokes about kids who thought they understood aviation. But the elderly veteran in 18D continued studying Elena with growing recognition and disbelief. Something about her bearing, the way she held herself, the precision of her movements, reminded him of people he had known in very different circumstances. As the aircraft continued through the night sky, Elena maintained her quiet observation of conditions outside her window. She wasn't watching scenery like other passengers. She was reading atmospheric conditions, flight patterns, and navigation markers with the trained eye of someone who understood aviation at a professional level. The silver badge remained hidden in her bag, but the old soldier had seen enough to make connections that would have shocked every other person in the cabin. The elderly man in 18D later whispered to himself, Falcon. Could it really be from that family line? That's impossible. They disappeared from all official records years ago. The peaceful flight was interrupted when sensitive UHF military communications began bleeding through the cabin's audio system. Static crackled as fragments of tactical radio transmissions became audible. Raptor lead has lost data link synchronization. Require immediate authentication. A young child began crying as the unfamiliar radio chatter frightened passengers throughout the cabin. Several people started recording the incident on their phones before flight attendants quickly moved to discourage unauthorized filming of what might be classified military communications. The captain's voice came over the intercom, maintaining professional calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some radio interference that will not affect our flight. Please remain seated and calm. But the radio interference continued, growing stronger. Raptor 2 showing low fuel, threat bearing 030. Cannot engage without proper authorization codes. Elena shifted slightly in her seat, and the businessman in 17C immediately pressed his hand down on her shoulder. Sit down, kid. This isn't your concern. The group of young men in row 16 turned around with smug expressions. Flying to America to become a pilot, little girl? Their laughter was loud and deliberately humiliating. The military radio chatter became more urgent. Raptor 2, low fuel. Threat bearing 030. Cannot fire without authentication codes. Elena quietly opened her canvas bag and pulled out the silver badge, but the businessman in 17C grabbed her wrist roughly. Put that toy away. This is serious business for adults. The badge slipped from her fingers and clinked against the metal armrest. The sound made the elderly man in 18D look up sharply with sudden, intense focus. The old veteran's voice carried unexpected authority. Let go of her hand. The businessman looked surprised, but released his grip, muttering about teenagers who didn't know their place. Elena stood up and walked toward the galley area, but a flight attendant immediately moved to intercept her. Honey, you need to return to your seat during the emergency. Elena showed her boarding pass, pointing to small symbols she had written along the margin. She spoke quietly in what sounded like a sequence of code words, delivered with the precise cadence of someone trained in military communications protocols. The flight attendant's expression changed completely. She stared at Elena's young face, then at the cryptic notations on the boarding pass, clearly struggling to process what she was seeing and hearing. The flight attendant called for the co-pilot, who approached with obvious skepticism about whatever issue a teenage passenger might be presenting. But when Elena looked directly into his eyes and spoke, her words carried authority that seemed impossible from someone her age. Guard frequency 243.0. Keep it clear for 10 seconds. The co-pilot's training recognized the terminology immediately. Only military personnel with specific clearances would know that frequency designation or understand its tactical significance. Elena's request was delivered with calm precision that belonged in a military command center, not from a teenager in a gray hoodie sitting in economy class. The co-pilot found himself following her instructions almost automatically. The radio static cleared as the emergency frequency was isolated. Military communications became clearer, revealing the urgency of the situation. F-22 Raptor fighters were operating in nearby airspace, but had lost their secure communication links with command authority. Elena's demeanor had completely transformed from quiet teenager to someone demonstrating professional competence in military aviation protocols. The change was so dramatic that the flight attendant could only stare in growing amazement. Other passengers remained unaware of what was happening in the galley area, but the businessman in 17C kept glancing over with irritation at the disruption being caused by the teenager he had dismissed. The elderly veteran in 18D watched Elena's interaction with the flight crew, his expression showing recognition mixed with disbelief. He had seen similar transformations in combat situations, when ordinary-looking people revealed extraordinary capabilities under pressure. Elena's quiet confidence as she coordinated with the flight crew suggested training that went far beyond what any civilian teenager should possess. Her knowledge of military communication protocols was precise and current, indicating active rather than historical familiarity. The radio chatter continued with increasing urgency as F-22 pilots struggled with authentication problems that were preventing them from responding to potential threats in their operational area. Elena listened to the military communications with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what was happening and why it mattered. Her young face showed none of the confusion that other passengers displayed when exposed to tactical military language. The co-pilot found himself taking direction from a 16-year-old girl, not because she demanded authority, but because her expertise was obviously genuine and immediately relevant to the emergency situation developing around their aircraft. The young flight attendant later wrote in her incident report, "Those eyes belonged to a pilot, not a passenger. I've worked international flights for 3 years, and I know the difference between someone pretending to have knowledge and someone who actually possesses it." This girl understood military aviation at a level that should have been impossible for her age. The emergency guard frequency opened, static faded, and the entire cabin fell into tense silence as passengers sensed that something significant was happening. Elena pressed the faded silver badge against the metal wall of the aircraft, holding her hand steady despite the slight turbulence. Her voice carried clearly over the radio, with calm authority that seemed to come from someone with decades of experience rather than a teenage passenger. She spoke deliberately. Falcon, Blue 9, Lineage Echo. The businessman in 17C burst into mocking laughter. Kids playing pretend pilot. This is ridiculous. But outside the aircraft, military command centers suddenly went silent. AWACS controllers sat up straighter at their stations. The response came immediately. Say again. Falcon? NORAD command broke into the frequency with unmistakable urgency. Authenticate immediately. Elena spoke 2 additional words, a private family designation that existed in no official records but was known to the highest levels of military aviation command. The codes she transmitted had been passed down through generations of a family that officially didn't exist. The effect was immediate and stunning. 2 F-22 Raptor pilots, who had been struggling with communication problems, suddenly received new instructions through channels they hadn't known were available. The lead F-22 pilot's voice cracked with emotion and recognition. Copy. Falcon lineage confirmed. Rules of engagement immediately changed throughout the operational area. Weapons free. Sector 2 cleared for defensive action. Radar signatures that had been threatening the airspace around their commercial flight suddenly disappeared. The sky fell silent, with the kind of peace that comes only when superior force has established complete control. The businessman in 17C shrank back in his seat, releasing his grip on the armrest as if it had become too hot to touch. His mocking laughter died completely as he began to understand that something far beyond his comprehension was taking place. AWACS command transmitted an update that left no doubt about the situation. Falcon lineage confirmed present on civilian flight. All units standing by for further instructions. Elena began providing tactical guidance with the casual expertise of someone who had been doing it her entire life. Raptor flight, maintain heading 270 to 240. Do not activate ECM systems. I have oversight. The lead Raptor pilot's response carried respect that would be given to a superior officer. Roger, ma'am, miss, maintaining heading as directed. The moment of perfect revenge came when the senior flight attendant began documenting the incident, noting that passenger 17C had physically restrained another passenger during an emergency situation and would need to provide a written statement upon landing. A woman in row 19 spoke loudly enough for others to hear, "Didn't you just call her a kid?" The cabin erupted in nervous laughter as passengers began to realize how completely the businessman had misjudged the situation. The businessman's face turned red with embarrassment and shame as he stammered apologies, but Elena simply gestured toward the incident report that would be filed with airport authorities upon landing. Other passengers began looking at Elena with new understanding, processing the fact that the teenager they had dismissed as irrelevant had just demonstrated authority over some of the most advanced military aircraft in the world. The radio traffic continued as Elena coordinated complex aerial operations from her economy class seat. All units maintain current positions. Threat assessment complete. Civilian traffic cleared through sector. Military personnel throughout the region were receiving orders from someone whose voice they had been trained to recognize and obey, even though she was supposedly just a passenger on a commercial flight. The young men who had been making jokes about Elena's aspirations to become a pilot now sat in stunned silence, understanding that they had been mocking someone whose aviation credentials exceeded anything they could imagine. Elena's transformation from quiet teenager to military command authority was so complete that passengers who hadn't witnessed it firsthand might not have believed it was the same person. The co-pilot who had initially been skeptical of taking direction from a teenage passenger now found himself supporting her coordination efforts with the respect typically shown to experienced air traffic controllers. Flight attendants who had assumed Elena was just another unaccompanied minor now understood they had been serving someone whose expertise in aviation operations surpassed their own training. The elderly veteran in 18D watched the entire sequence with tears in his eyes, finally understanding that he had been sitting near a member of the legendary family whose service to military aviation had become the stuff of legends. NORAD Command provided final confirmation that eliminated any remaining doubt. Falcon authentication confirmed. All operational units report secure. Civilian flight cleared to continue. Elena returned the silver badge to her canvas bag and pulled her gray hoodie up to partially cover her face, returning to the anonymous appearance of just another teenager traveling alone. But every person in the cabin now understood that appearances could be profoundly deceiving, and that expertise might be found in the most unexpected places and among the most unlikely people. The businessman who had grabbed her wrist and dismissed her as irrelevant now faced official documentation of his interference with emergency procedures, while Elena had demonstrated capabilities that would be discussed in military aviation circles for years to come. The final radio transmission came from the F-22 lead pilot. Falcon, thank you for guidance. Returning to patrol status. His voice carried the kind of gratitude typically reserved for someone who had just saved lives and prevented an international incident. Elena's response was characteristically brief. Falcon returning to silent status. Then the military frequencies went quiet, leaving only the normal sounds of commercial aviation. The cabin atmosphere had completely transformed from casual dismissal to respectful recognition. But Elena seemed uninterested in the attention, preferring to return to her anonymous status as just another passenger. Elena returned to seat 17A quietly, pulling her gray hoodie forward to shadow her face while tucking the silver badge deep into her canvas bag. The transformation back to anonymous teenager was as complete as her earlier reveal had been dramatic. The young flight attendant approached with trembling hands, offering a glass of water. "I'm sorry for not recognizing who you were earlier, miss." Elena smiled gently. "You did your job properly. There was no way you could have known." The elderly veteran in 18D carefully pulled out an old military photograph and whispered, "I once owed my life to someone with that name." He showed her a faded image of aircraft and personnel from decades past. Elena touched the photograph briefly with 2 fingers, bowed her head in acknowledgement, then returned it with both hands in a gesture of respect that honored his service and sacrifice. A young boy in row 12 whispered to his mother, "Who is Falcon?" His mother replied softly, "Someone who keeps the skies safe for everyone else." The businessman in 17C wanted to apologize personally, but Elena shook her head slightly. "Save it for your written statement." Her message was clear. His actions would have official consequences that words couldn't undo. The captain's announcement carried noticeable relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have cleared the interference zone and are proceeding normally to our destination." His voice was lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from the entire flight. The cabin atmosphere had transformed completely, from casual indifference to quiet respect and unity. Passengers who had been strangers now felt connected by witnessing something extraordinary that challenged their assumptions about competence and authority. Many passengers began writing in journals or phones, documenting what they had witnessed. The story of the teenager who had commanded F-22 fighters would be shared for years, though most official records would remain classified. Children throughout the cabin looked at Elena with wide-eyed wonder, understanding that heroes could look like anyone and might be sitting in the seat next to them during ordinary flights. The flight crew began treating all passengers with increased attention and respect, recognizing that they might not always be able to identify who among their passengers possessed special skills or security clearances. Elena resumed her quiet observation of the night sky through the small aircraft window, appearing once again to be just another young person traveling alone. But every person in the cabin now understood that appearances could be profoundly misleading. The transformation wasn't just about recognizing Elena's hidden authority. It was about understanding that competence, expertise, and responsibility might be found in the most unexpected places and among people who chose not to advertise their capabilities. The elderly veteran spent the remainder of the flight in grateful reflection, understanding that the family name he had heard in combat situations decades earlier was still active and still protecting people who would never know how close they had come to danger. Airport security protocols were quietly updated based on the incident, with new recognition that passengers with legitimate security clearances might not always fit expected profiles or age demographics. As the aircraft continued toward New York, passengers settled into a different kind of quiet than before. It was no longer casual indifference, but respectful recognition that they had witnessed something that would change how they viewed strangers and made assumptions about capabilities. Comment justice if you believe that people should never be underestimated because of their age or appearance. Several days after the flight landed safely at JFK Airport, aviation news outlets reported briefly on a communication incident involving F-22 Raptor fighters, but no details were released about the source of coordination. The name Falcon never appeared in any public reports. A military veteran's blog published a cryptic entry. That night, the sky stood still for one heartbeat, waiting for a name that shouldn't exist. The post generated thousands of comments from veterans who recognized the reference, but couldn't elaborate on classified operations. The businessman from seat 17C was required to submit a detailed incident report about his interference with a passenger during an emergency situation. The experience fundamentally changed his approach to judging others, making him significantly more humble about making assumptions based on age or appearance. 2 weeks later, Elena sat in a small coffee shop in Brooklyn, wearing the same gray hoodie and old headphones that had marked her as an ordinary teenager on the flight. She placed the silver badge on the wooden table while waiting for her order. The young barista noticed the worn metal and asked curiously, "Is Falcon a band or something?" Elena smiled quietly. "It's a family name." The barista studied the faded engravings, but couldn't make out the details. "What kind of family?" "The kind that stays quiet until someone needs help," Elena replied, carefully returning the badge to her pocket. Military aviation forums began discussing the incident in coded language, with speculation about which family lines still maintained operational clearances for emergency situations. Official responses remained classified, but veteran pilots shared stories about voices that appeared during critical moments when everything seemed lost. The passengers from Flight 447 maintained contact through social media, sharing memories of the night when their assumptions about a teenager were completely shattered. Many admitted that the experience had permanently changed how they looked at young people and made judgments about capabilities. Flight attendants at major airlines received enhanced training about recognizing passengers with special clearances or backgrounds who might be able to assist during emergencies, regardless of their apparent age or civilian status. Elena's story became a case study at military academies, though most details remained classified. The lesson was clear. Expertise and authority could emerge from unexpected sources when circumstances demanded action. Children who had been on the flight grew up with a different understanding of heroism, recognizing that the person who saves your life might look like an ordinary teenager rather than someone in a uniform with obvious credentials. Years later, when aviation professionals gathered to discuss close calls and remarkable interventions, someone would inevitably mention the teenager who had made F-22 pilots stand at attention and had prevented an international incident from economy class. The silver badge with the Falcon engraving became symbolic among military families, representing the idea that service often continues across generations in ways that remain invisible to the general public. Elena continued her quiet life, attending school and maintaining the appearance of an ordinary teenager while carrying responsibilities that officially didn't exist in any public records. The incident reinforced an important lesson about assumptions, respect, and the hidden capabilities that exist all around us. Never judge someone's worth or competence based on their age, appearance, or the seat they're assigned. The loudest sound isn't always the engines, but the laughter of people who don't understand the person sitting in front of them. True authority doesn't need to announce itself. It reveals itself when lives depend on knowledge and courage. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.